Hey, hello, everyone. My name's Khaled Bendour, one of the co-editors of Fathom. Alongside me is my other co-editor, Jack Omer Jackman, and we are very pleased to be joined by Koby Huberman, um, the co-chair of the Israeli Peace Initiative, also the Israeli Regional Initiative. And this is part of a series we've been doing called Those Who Tried. Different negotiators. We've had Israelis, we've had Americans who've talked about Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and the lessons they feel could be drawn from them. And we've had Fathom's had a relationship with Koby for many years. And when we asked him to come on, he said yes, but with one condition: that it's not those who tried, it's those who try in the present tense, not in the past tense. And so we're very much looking forward to having this sort of conversation that also has perhaps even more contemporary relevance than other conversations might have. So, Koby, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Koby, we're talking in the wake of a ceasefire just beginning between Israel and Hamas. It was yesterday we saw the first of what I hope with all my heart are many releases of Israeli hostages. I was struck by how when the ceasefire was first announced, we saw, maybe predictably, a series of very well-meaning Western politicians talking about how now is the time for a process to begin in earnest, leading to lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. We'll leave for the moment, though perhaps we'll get back to, if there's time, quite how in tune those politicians are to the depth of trauma both people have suffered the last 15 months, why anyone would think those were necessarily fertile conditions for a lasting peace. But it also struck me that these were people for whom the traditional paradigm remains intact. That traditional paradigm being that Israel's regional normalization, its peace with other Middle Eastern neighbors, would follow its peace with the Palestinians, be a product of it, in fact. You're one of the most prominent Israeli thinkers who have for some time kind of reversed that paradigm and looked to the region first. Perhaps you can begin by explaining the background to the traditional way of thinking, some of its effects and limitations, and then take us through what led to your embrace of a new way of thinking.
Well, first of all, let me first frame what I have believed since 2006, actually, not as a regional first, bilateral next, but or what people used to call outside in. My belief in has always been that these two processes should be combined in parallel. Uh, and I think that there are many myths that were true already back in 2006, and not necessarily just after the terrible events of October 7th, that have changed the need for a new process. It was already necessary back then. And if I may, allow me to elaborate. The the original the original idea that Israelis and Palestinians should first agree on a deal between them, and then and only then it will be followed by normalization with the entire Arab and Muslim world. That idea was basically created at the heart of the first the Saudi initiative, and then later on in the framework of the Arab Peace Initiative back in March 2022, about March 2002. And the idea was to present normal relations between Israel and the Arab world as a kind of a reward for agreeing everything with the Palestinians, and may I add, with also Syria, because the Arab Peace Initiative addressed every piece of territory that was then held by Israel. The major flaw of this idea, first of all, we should say that the API, the Arab Peace Initiative, was a major breakthrough because for the first time ever, it offered a possible end to the Israeli Arab conflict, not just the Israeli Palestinian conflict. And it offered a vision of complete normal relations as stated in the UN Charter between countries that have peace, which meant full recognition, diplomatic relations, and more. That paradigm failed because of many reasons, both because it is impossible for Israelis and Palestinians to reach an agreement on their own without Arab involvement, and because practically the Arab Peace Initiative has never been accepted as a viable framework to start negotiations. That was the situation that we encountered in 2006. On the one hand, here is a regional framework that was never before available for Israelis. And on the other hand, it is a non-starter, not just because of what's written in it, but because the idea of sequentiality is flawed. Let me explain this. If Israelis and Palestinians sit to the table to discuss a permanent status agreement, ending all core issues between them, they have to address the issue of Jerusalem. But you cannot negotiate the issue of Jerusalem just between Israelis and Palestinians. First, the holy places, Haram Sharif in particular, is an Islamic issue. It's not a Palestinian territorial issue. You have to discuss it with other members of the Arab world, particularly Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Morocco. Second, specifically to Jerusalem, it has been, especially since 2013, it has been already agreed by President Abbas that the whole negotiations of Jerusalem shall be held by Jordan along the lines of Chapter 9 in its peace agreement with Israel. So you cannot discuss Jerusalem just between the two sides. You cannot negotiate any settlement of the Palestinian refugees without the involvement of those countries who take care of refugees, say Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. You cannot discuss solutions without the donors. You cannot discuss the final border without security arrangements that involve Arab countries, specifically Jordan and Egypt. You cannot discuss the establishment of capacity and state building efforts, let alone the economic situation of the would-be Palestinian entity without Arab countries. And you cannot present the Palestinian people with the necessary encouragement for the tough decisions that they need to make without the involvement of Arab countries. And so is the case with the Israeli people. So the whole idea that later on, I started in 2006, but we had the Annapolis process and then we had the Kerry process and more attempts to revive bilateral negotiations. These were flawed on the very basis that Israelis and Palestinians cannot conclude a final status agreement on their own. I would say even an interim status agreement could not be agreed between the parties because it will have to have both involvement, monitoring, and benefits to be offered to both sides. But the other reason why it couldn't work is that, let's think that I'm coming to one of you and I'm saying, let's negotiate a deal. And you say, you know what? please negotiate the deal with our Palestinian brother. And when you're done, we'll tell you what's in it for you. Only afterwards shall we sit to the table and discuss what are the concrete elements of normal relations, what will be done in the region, how we shall cooperate, etc., etc. In other words, the sequential negotiations doesn't give the Israeli side any motivation to engage and give all the necessary concession up front to the Palestinians without knowing what's in it for us on the regional scale. And as a result of that, in 2006, and it was after the Lebanese war, we said it's time to think about a new paradigm, because you cannot agree on all the issues with the Palestinians, and you're not encouraged by the Arab countries to engage in any negotiations unless you're putting all your concession up front, and only then we begin negotiating the regional benefits. And then what we did is to say, perhaps we should orchestrate the whole thing differently. First, we need to discuss a complete vision. What will be the end game? Not only on the Palestinian scale, but also on the regional scale. Maybe it's time to understand, what do we mean by cooperation? How does it manifest itself? And in what way we could then, as Israelis first, we can articulate a new calculus that says, here is a concession to the Palestinian that is rewarded by a significant benefit from the Arab world. Let me just demonstrate this with one very simple parallel. We are interested in security. Let's say that we have a situation where our security arrangements, or our sense of security, is in danger because of Iran, let alone its proxies. Now, you cannot expect a policeman in the middle of Ramallah with which we have already cut a final status agreement. We cannot expect them to provide security against Iran. And therefore, the equation is, we may concede something to the Palestinians if and only if we are sure that we can cooperate on the security element with Iran. But it is not against Iran. But it is not just security. It is almost on everything: economic cooperation, de-radicalization, recognition, etc., etc. We have to be concrete. And therefore, our initial idea was, let's sit to the table and think about an end game scenario that has 4 components. Here is an agreement with the Palestinians, at the time, the classic 2-state solution, as part of a regional framework that has regional security cooperation, agreement with the Arab world, or some of the Arab states, regional cooperation agreement, and a path to normal relations, building up on de-radicalization and recognition, mutual recognition. And then we said, fine, if we sit to the table and talk about all of these together in a triangular manner, in a track with the Palestinians, in parallel to a track with the Arab world, and a round table with all of them, only then we could make rational decisions about concessions, and we look at the final product of the process with both. That was the initial approach that we presented. And we said, yes, we can take the Arab Peace Initiative as a possible framework, but we cannot accept it as it is. And therefore, we need to present a mirroring, comprehensive regional Palestinian-Israeli proposal. And thus we created the Israeli Peace Initiative, which was mirroring the Arab Peace Initiative, but had those elements that I've just described. And we said, if we take these two frameworks as the terms of reference as a starter, we could then design a process with a triangular model, namely Israeli Palestinians and Arab players. And then you could look at, both productive involvement of the Arab players in the resolution of core issues, and you can create productive and positive involvement that would give Israel the necessary incentives to make concessions to the Palestinians. And above all, just by introducing new players, you could influence the confidence and the willingness of the Israeli public to make progress. So I'm sorry for this lengthy explanation, but it's extremely important to understand that we are not inside out and we are not outside in. We were thinking about a parallel process from the very first moment. I should also say that, I'd like to give you one anecdote, that this is not a theoretical issue. In a conversation with one of the senior Palestinians who participated in conferences and peace negotiation teams, he dragged me in one of our track 2 meetings. He dragged me and he said, "It's about time, Koby, that you understand that we will never accept some decisions that we know are vital, because then we will be dead. And the only way we will accept them, knowing that we will be alive, is if those decisions are shown as, or are imposed upon us by the Arab world. Only then, with the Arab world backing, we will be making rational decisions on some issues that otherwise we are not capable of addressing, and especially we cannot look to the eyes of our Palestinian society." And he said, when we regionalize, or when we create an Islamic circle around certain decisions, then if it is what he said, iradat al-umma al-islamiyya, if this is the willingness, or this is what the Islamic world wants, then who are we as Palestinians to veto it? And he said, you have to understand that dynamic. This is at the core of why we will always say no if we are on our own, and we may say yes when we are surrounded by a bigger team. Now, by the way, another anecdote on that particular point: if you read or listened to the amazing interview by Prince Bandar bin Sultan to Al Arabiya right after the Abraham Accords were signed, he will go in that interview in length and explain how he personally felt betrayed by Yasser Arafat back in January January 2001, just days before the inauguration, and when President Clinton would be replaced by President Bush. In a meeting in the hotel in Washington, he was led to believe by Arafat that Arafat had accepted the Clinton parameters, and then two things happen. There will be a new era in the Middle East, and Prince Bandar could go back to his vacation that he was so keen to continue. Those events in January 2001 when key people in the Arab world were led to believe that Arafat is about or has already or would announce his agreement with Clinton parameters, that would be a major breakthrough in the Middle East, because it would both end the conflict and allow them to go and implement their strategic intent to normalize with Israel. And it was then solid already then, especially with Saudi Arabia. That event and its failure and the sense of betrayal that Prince Bandar has conveyed to his leaders and other leaders led to the creation of the Arab Peace Initiative, which 15 months later was ratified in Beirut, about 14 months later. So, because of the inevitability of regional involvement, we thought that the way to implement the Arab Peace Initiative was through parallel negotiations, both in terms of the end game solution, and we thought that the willingness to negotiate based on the Arab Peace Initiative was not enough, and other frameworks had to be added so that the negotiation table is enriched with different frameworks and different ideas that are all possible starting points and not end points. And this is why we created the Israeli Peace Initiative. It took us 3 years between 2007 and 2010 to craft it and eventually present it. But that was the underlying logic behind this.
Koby, thank you. That's fascinating.
I'm giving you some baseline for this conversation.
Absolutely, tremendously valuable baseline. I've just got one follow-up before I hand over to Caleb. It relates to your first anecdote. I think it would really help viewers and listeners if you could give us some sense of what the issues were that the Palestinians communicated to you they would require the appearance of persuasion from the Arab world to make concessions on. So what are those issues? Are we talking Jerusalem, right of return here? What were the issues that you felt they needed that appearance?
Well, on that particular moment when I was dragged to the corridor, it was first and foremost on the issue of refugees. But later on, in other occasions, it was meant as well with respect to Jerusalem. I would say these were the two major issues that I encountered the logic of the, understanding of Palestinians that the rational decisions, namely the inability to implement the right of return in its fullness and the inability to negotiate concessions on the issue of Jerusalem is only going to be addressed and covered by regional involvement. Only then they would be willing to accept what they already knew then was a logical, pragmatic, and a fair solution.
Thank you, Koby.
Thank you, Koby. I think for a lot of people, their understanding of Israel's relations with the Arab world kind of came more into full exposure in kind of mid to late 2020 with the Abraham Accords. Obviously, you were involved in discussions and relationships for years before. Can you share with us some of the insights you gained both in the years before the Abraham Accords, leading up to them, and then let's say in the 3 years following it, from September 2020 to let's say September 2023? What did you learn? What was the journey you went on? What would be helpful for us to know now?
Excellent. Well, first of all, the model that we presented initially of endgame negotiations based on a shared vision, both regional and bilateral or Israeli-Palestinian, over the years we realized that this is not going to happen in the way that we initially envisioned it. The reason is, and I think it's important to understand, that when you ask people to sit to the table and discuss the end game, end of conflict, and you tell them this is the objective of these negotiations, it means that they will have the last chance to consume any request and any demand they ever had in mind in every detail and every small detail, and is now becoming a showstopper. Why? Because as we make progress in the negotiation, and especially because the underlying assumption is, or the policy is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Then when you put that as an objective, you're going to spend tremendous amount of time and effort and negotiation energy and capacity to negotiate, say, 95, 98% of the deal, but the last 2% that are toughest and most important ones left till the very end are going to annihilate all your achievements up to that 98%, just because 2% is not yet concluded. And therefore, in terms of spending of political capital, negotiation capital, and capacity to achieve a full and end of conflict, end of claims deal on both bilateral and regional elements is almost a way to ensure that negotiations will never end. And therefore we said, okay, so we must make progress in parallel, but maybe we should make progress in steps. We need to craft a process that sets a, say, a very generic endgame statement that sets a horizon for both bilateral and regional players. But we need to make progress in steps, because otherwise we are risking too much in the march towards the endgame. So how do we combine horizon, endgame, phasing, and a more reasonable process that the parties could digest? Now, when it comes to the Arab players in the equation, how do we create? We cannot ask them to agree on full normalization because we haven't concluded negotiations. How can we create a process towards normal relation in which some of the steps that have been agreed between Israelis and Arabs are linked to progress made on the Israeli-Palestinian side, and vice versa? How do we use progress made between Israelis and Arabs on certain points to encourage progress on the Israeli-Palestinian side? If you like, it's a progress where you walk in two lanes of the same highway, but you strengthen the progress in each one of them through mutually agreed upon progress in steps, even before you reach the highway, the end of the highway. And that is why we turned our thinking towards a phased, parallel, comprehensive process between Israelis, Palestinians, and Arab countries. And that was the major breakthrough that we realized back in 2013, right after Protective Edge operation in the summer of 2014. And that was the new paradigm that we created, by the way, through track 2 discussions with all the major stakeholders in the region. It was then clear to us that one of the elements that was missing is a much better understanding of the economic benefits that would change the region had we reached a diplomatic agreement, a comprehensive diplomatic agreement. And this is why we created a parallel track 2 team out of representatives from 8 countries in the region that we later and eventually called Regionomics, where we tried to articulate the economic benefits to all parties as a result of a comprehensive parallel progress. And we showed that over a period of 10 years, there will be huge economic projects built in the region with tremendous economic benefits. Something like an annual addition of $1 trillion to the collective GDP in the region, which was a huge number and warranted that there will be below 2-digit unemployment rate in most of Arab countries and tremendous progress in Palestinian economy, Jordanian economy, Egyptian and Israeli economy in particular. So with these two, we noticed back in 2016 that there was a growing interest of colleagues in the United Arab Emirates to engage in these discussions. And all of a sudden, we felt that the discourse with some of the Gulf countries, and in complete contradiction, the animosity that we felt from the Qataris and their negative approach, it became extremely clear that the Gulf itself is divided between the or the progress shown by the willingness of the UAE, Bahraini, Saudi under the table as the 3 most important players who want to make progress. A very negative approach, on the other hand, by Kuwait on the extreme edge. Next to it, Qatar, which maintained a level of relationship, but was not perceived as a productive and cooperative force, even in the GCC itself. And Oman, that was actually sitting on the fences, waiting for some progress, especially after it had enabled the secret channel between the USA and Iran that led to the JCPOA just a year earlier. So the model that we eventually saw back in 2016, all of a sudden included an economic component to it and a much stronger linkage between diplomatic, security, and economic considerations. And we sense that in our track 2 efforts, in our dialogues and roundtables. This was then, I would say, fortified. This was strengthened by the major decisions that were taken both by UAE leadership, by the UAE leaders and by Saudi leaders, with different styles, with different approaches, with different level of publicity. And when President Trump took office in January 2017, the combination of both diplomatic, security, and economic discourses was much clearer. His business-like approach and his team's approach combined, or actually allowed us to present the logic of the regionomics and the regional package that we presented. And they were very keen to follow that as the underlying logic of what eventually became the Trump initiative presented in January 2020. But I think that also accelerated another element. We already then knew that the UAE is very keen to see progress, and it was very worried by the what they perceived as a veto power of the Palestinians, especially given the behavior of the PA vis-a-vis the Trump administration. I don't know if you remember, but the first full month of President Trump were all rosy. He concluded those 4 months in a trip to Saudi Arabia, came back from Riyadh to Tel Aviv, and we all felt that peace is about to knock on the doors because he was very encouraged by what he heard in Saudi Arabia, by what he heard in Israel, but he was, in a very blunt manner, rejected by the PA. Later on, a few months later, the move of the embassy to Jerusalem was another move. And therefore, I think that the atmosphere that we began to sense back in 2017 and onward was what I would later call pre-normalization phase by some of the players. And I think it all amalgamated into one moment between the spring and the summer of 2020. Remember that at the time in January, President Trump presented his plan. And one of the participants in the meeting in which he presented it was no other than the UAE ambassador to the United States, Mr. Al-Taiba, who later on, and I think it was late June 2020, published an article in the Israeli press that asked the Israelis to decide if they want to annex parts of the West Bank or they want normal relations. And guess what? Israelis chose right. The Israeli leadership made the right decision. And that led within a few months to the signing of the Abraham Accords and the combination of other countries. So there were three drivers: the failure of the participation of the Palestinians in 2017 and onward, the growing linkage between a regional economic vision and regional vision of security and diplomatic arrangements, and the concerns of some of the countries that they might lose the train and the opportunity to fulfill their own national interest because of Palestinian rejectionism of diplomatic arrangements, diplomatic negotiations. That is the path that I saw leading to the Abraham Accord. What happened afterwards is a very different chapter. First and foremost, it changed the mindset of Israelis for good and for bad. For good, because for the first time, they were able to fly over the Arab Peninsula. They were able to go to the Gulf and see the amazing locations in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Bahrain. And they were able to go back to Morocco. So there was a huge change of attitude in that sense. But it had also a dangerous side issue because it led some or too many of the Israelis to believe that now they can completely bypass and neglect the Palestinian issue. We were not quiet after the Abraham Accords. We felt that a huge milestone has been put on the ground, has been agreed, but it would go nowhere if we do not address the Palestinian issue in parallel. And this is why, from the very first moment after the Abraham Accord, we went back to basics and said, well, now is the time to move to the next phase and take advantage of the Abraham Accords and expand them with the addition of Saudi Arabia. But that meant we need to make progress on the Palestinian issue as well. And all of a sudden, we had very different partners to negotiate, not to negotiate, but to discuss these issues. And these were friends from the Gulf, who from the very first moment understood the complexity of the Palestinian issue and at the same time were committed to address it in one way or another. And I will say this, and I begin to argue that our failure, or the failure to engage differently with the Palestinians after the Abraham Accord, partially because they again rejected the whole scheme, and partially because there was no incentive for the parties from Europe or the US administrations or other member of the international community. There was no encouragement to go and move to the next phase with the Palestinians. I think that was one of the best triggers for Iran and its spoilers and proxies in the region to encourage an October 7th attack. And this is one of the reasons why Hamas and other organizations saw this as an opportunity to again attack the Abraham Accords and to derail the normalizations train, because it was about to make progress on the Saudi file. And by the way, let there be no doubt, Saudi Arabia would never sign a deal with Israel without some kind of a Palestinian element that could be, integrated with a normalization deal. They were never going to do that. But the attack on October 7th, on one hand, derailed the train. And now, when we hear again that there is a normalization deal, it requires a much more comprehensive Palestinian component to it than ever before.
So that you very much have preempted my final question there, Koby, which is that in many people's estimation, pre-October 7th, that the kind of Netanyahuist view was that normalization with Saudi Arabia was possible, as was keeping the Israeli government together, because the kind of concessions that MBS might ask for in return for normalization were kind of cosmetic or minor enough for Netanyahu to be able to sell domestically. Is yours? You've hinted just there that the awful last 15 months might have made the Saudi demands on the Palestinian front rather more far-reaching than they would have been 15 months ago. Is that right?
Well, before I address this question, we must acknowledge that the original logic of an integrated approach to a bilateral and regional issue has been justified many times over the past 15 months, not just because the theaters of conflict were connected, and all of a sudden we are not in a bilateral war. This is not the war between Israel and Hamas. We have Hezbollah, we have Shiite militia in Yemen, the Houthis, we have threats from the Jordanian territory, from Syria, from militia in Iraq, and from Iran itself. It's a very different conflict, but it created a very clear understanding that we are not in a bilateral conflict anymore, and therefore, for sure, it cannot be addressed through bilateral diplomacy. It has to have a comprehensive regional Palestinian-Israeli approach. That's first step. Second, some of the benefits that our approach called for many years ago were very clearly proven in the way Arab countries and Israelis under the CENTCOM and through other models of cooperation were able to confront Iranian attacks. And therefore, the whole paradigm of regional approach has not been shattered. On the contrary, it is now clear to everybody this is the only way to go forward. And any agreement between us and Palestinians cannot be done or cannot be implemented, cannot be initiated without looking at a regional security platform, without looking at the coalition of regional players, without looking at a more reasonable process, without allowing the parties to recover from the traumas they have suffered from and they are suffering. And therefore, the component in the Saudi-Israeli relationship, the specific component is just one element of one much bigger scheme that has to be agreed. And again, it cannot be agreed all up front. It has to be put in phases. It has to address the situation on the ground. And therefore we are not just trying to move the clock backwards to October 6th and just cross different T's and dot different I's. It's got to be a more relevant arrangement. And one of the things that we have seen, by the way, in Israel, just in the past 6 months, new organizations and new initiatives are now building up their schemes based on what we originally presented in the past 18 years, a regional approach. And I'm extremely pleased to say, they are all following in one way or another, with one variation or another. They're following the very logic that we presented almost 18 years ago. And these are new organizations and new initiatives and new faces that came to the very realization that it is time for a more comprehensive approach. And it is, for me, it is very encouraging. Just last week, a new organization launched its plan called the Abraham Shield, and a full hall of supporters in Tel Aviv, presenting a very concrete plan how to implement the regional approach and finish the war with Gaza and address the Syrian front and address the Iranian front and make progress towards the Palestinians. So I'm very pleased to see that this approach is now, amalgamating itself or recreated by different organizations, different flavors of the very same logic. And it wouldn't have been possible, I'm afraid, in October 6th, because it was not on the agenda. And now people have realized that they need to spell regional approach with a capital R, and they understand what it means right now. And it is everywhere. Anyway, from the very significant question of who will control Gaza and how will you de-radicalize Gaza, and who will take care of the enforcement of a new deal with Lebanon, the ceasefire with Lebanon, how Iran will be blocked, what we will do with the Houthis. All of these are regional issues and require engagement between Israeli and Arab players. And some of it has already begun for the past 15 months. So, in a way, October 7th was meant to kill the regional progress. 15 months later, it is the trigger to implement regional progress.
I mean, Koby, that's really fascinating. I mean, it sounds to me like it strengthened the logic of the regional approach, and I guess it remains to be seen whether it makes it easier or makes it harder. But certainly that idea of not being able to solve things in a bilateral way, but it certainly strengthen that. I would say that you've not that we doubted it, but you've certainly proven the those who try rather than those who tried. This was really fascinating and a great privilege for us to hear you and learn from your wisdom and insights. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to continuing the conversation at some later stage, hopefully.
Well, I'm very, very pleased to share these thoughts with you, but I do hope that within a few years we would not need to have this conversation again, because it's about time to stop trying, and it's about time that new leaders in the region, in Israel, Palestinian people, regional leaders, take responsibility, look at the current horrible events as a trigger for a new opportunity, and post-crisis look at a new approach to implement what was already on the table in terms of the underlying logic back then. And God willing, with the help of President Trump or other leaders, our regional leaders will do the right thing, knowing that it is going to be a longer path, but a more secure one if they only engaged the different approaches in two dimensions. First, it is not just Israeli-Palestinian, but Israeli regional and Israeli-Palestinian tracks. And second, it is not just security and endgame, it is a phased approach that takes both security, economic development, de-radicalization, changes in the reality on the ground, and a more mature framework to block Iran and spoilers. If they took that upon themselves as the major lesson of October 7th, then there is a chance that within the next, I would say, decade, we will see that the logic of the regional approach has not been just proven through horrible events and conflict and wars, but also through some phased progress towards a much better future and a much more powerful vision than just the ultimate peace of 40, 50 years ago, but something that is a little bit more solid and provides proof on the ground that the leaders of the region are serious about building the process towards success.
Amen.